Hello everybody, we are back for another geeky time. More geekville, geek. I can't talk today. First of all, admire my bunny ears because that is perfectly centered. I love this shirt. Comic-Con is really where I have found the most enjoyable items in my life. And the fact that coronavirus has made Comic-Con go away this year has saddened my heart, people. Has saddened my heart, which is why we're going to talk about some geeky stuff like the state of games, which is kind of a depressing topic, maybe. But I want to talk about it from the sense that as someone who grew up and has really seen huge transitions between the gaming that happened when I was younger, when I was a wee fellow, when I was a little baby, and how games are today. So one of my biggest heartbreaks has been not just the state of games, it's really the state of story crafting in games. And it's going to be a little bit positive what I'm saying, but mainly negative. I remember as a child, when I started getting into RPGs, when I started getting into very story-driven gaming, I was in love. I started off as just a huge bookworm. I grew up in a family where my mother's reading tons of fantasy, my uncle's reading tons of fantasy, and they really threw everything at me. The Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Wheel of Time series. I was reading this stuff when I was like 6, 7 years old. So fantasy was just boom. And then when I started getting into RPGs and, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, I was just loving it. Legend of the Dragoon. PlayStation was like the shit when I was younger. And those games, sure, graphically, they were, especially compared to now. You didn't have as much open world. It was pretty linear, but the stories mattered. You cared about the characters. You really saw potential that you could build up on. You cared about who your characters were. Even Zelda, which your character is pretty, we will say, faceless in the sense he has no personality per se. There was something about it. You still cared about Link. It had magic to it. And then Final Fantasy X rolled out. And Final Fantasy X, for me, changed the game. It was just the graphics took this phenomenal leap. You had CGI scenes that were just, these cutscenes were just amazing. Things I had never seen, even in many times in anime and animation at that point. Like the cutscenes in Final Fantasy X were beautiful. And I cared about the characters, and whether or not you like Final Fantasy X or not, that's up to you. But from the story scope was epic. It was phenomenal. I loved the gameplay. Everything was just really, really capturing me. And then for me, for the next 8 years, so probably like 8 or 9 years, almost nothing came out story-wise, especially in the RPG sphere. Now, there's some people will argue, there were some JRPGs that came out, but really comparatively to the Final Fantasy games of the PlayStation era and even Final Fantasy X, there was almost nothing, because there was a huge boost at that point. There were so many games, and then it just dive bombed. And why did that happen? It is because of the boost in graphic capacity. So the boost in graphic capacity just changed the game. People were able to produce these like really pretty looking games, but that dropped off story-wise. And we started focusing a lot more on the mechanics of games and combat. And even then we saw a lot of just crap games come out. Because it was so easy comparatively to make a game now that studios were just producing, and we got so much garbage for so long. There were shining lights throughout the years, like even around the time of Final Fantasy X, we had Shadow Hearts, which I don't know if anyone's ever played Shadow Hearts, but I love Shadow Hearts. I still have to find it. The few times I've been able to see a copy or two on sale, not on sale, but being sold on Amazon or whatnot. They're like $150. I don't know if I'm willing to spend that much money to get a copy of Shadow Hearts again. I don't know why I sold mine when I was younger. But for anyone out there who has played Shadow Hearts, if you love it as much as I do, well, Shadow Hearts, what was it, Covenant, the next game, and then there was another one that I can't recall the name. Those I just prefer to ignore. I did not enjoy them in the slightest, but the original Shadow Hearts was so cool. It completely got overshadowed by Final Fantasy X, unfortunately, but it was a great game. And then over the years, there was little titles, like Enslaved, actually, for anyone who's ever played Enslaved. It was a little short game, more of an adventure-style action game that, again, didn't really get much popularity, but the story, what they were trying to accomplish back then, was really, really beautiful and touching, and I think it was a great motivator, maybe, and I wouldn't be surprised if people who have tried, let's say, God of War, and the character interaction between Kratos and his son, and that kind of interaction, I wouldn't be surprised if those people got a bit inspired by games like Enslaved, which had this great like interaction happening between two characters. So there's been little shining lights in the darkness over the years, but many times those games were actually not RPGs. They were adventure style games, and they tended to be very, very short and sweet. But it's been the last, I would have to say, 4 years or so, that magic has really started to happen as far as I'm concerned. You did have the original remake of the Tomb Raider series, which I thought was phenomenal. I didn't really like the second and third game that much. I didn't get into it, but that first game was just powerful to me. It really hit home emotionally, really made me care about Lara Croft. God of War, again, that remake. I never got into the old God of War games, but this remake, we will say, of the God of War series was phenomenal and just emotionally captivating. And that's changing. I think the indie sphere now has made it that caring about just the aesthetics and the story of the game has become paramount. And so that has given me a lot of hope. But still, from an RPG perspective, I guess this is really becoming more of an RPG-focused video. Is just RPG-wise, I've really seen almost nothing that I could think of. I mean, you could consider Witcher 3 an RPG, I suppose, but it's still more of a hack and slash kind of game. It's more of an adventure-style game as far as I'm concerned, although it does have a lot of RPG mechanics. So we could put in there, if you count Witcher 3, it's phenomenal. And I mean, people might consider the open world Bethesda games like Elder Scrolls to be RPGs. I don't really consider them to be RPGs. I consider them more adventure games again. But again, we can sort of consider those a little bit in. But when you look at the old, very hardcore, story-driven RPGs, I mean, the only one I could maybe think of that's really hit the ball, Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 1 and 3 were whatever, but Mass Effect 2 was hugely story-driven because almost everyone who ever includes Mass Effect 2 in their, let's say, top 10 lists, it is because the character development of those games is insane. They're so good and interesting that you play Mass Effect 2 just to get to know the characters. That is a story-driven game. Witcher 3, again, I'm trying to think, again, I could maybe include God of War because it has some RPG style elements and the story is so driving in it. Horizon Zero Dawn, I love Horizon Zero Dawn. Aloy, I think I'm saying her name properly. She was such an interesting character. I loved her so much, and the world was so engaging. Even though it was not that large, it was still a pretty open world, but just it was. Every single aspect of it was so well detailed that even though I didn't get to know so much about the world, I cared about every single aspect of it, and through her eyes, I loved everything about that game. But again, if we go back to those old style kind of RPGs where it's just this really character-driven story and you against some kind of enemy or a world, that hasn't really happened that much in the last few years. I was really hoping for Final Fantasy 15 to have that. Instead, it just kind of dropped dead for me. Final Fantasy 15 was maybe this might be controversial, but I consider Final Fantasy 15 to be garbage. I've never been so bored. The fact that, you would think I would love it more because some people were annoyed by this, but the fact that you had to like watch a movie and the animation to really get to know those characters might have been something I really enjoyed, because I don't mind doing that stuff. I love animation, I love films and whatnot. But the films were just made it more confusing. I cared about the characters less. A huge part of the beginning and even middle of the game was just monotonous, and I didn't care about the characters. The whole concept of like going along with your friends should have made me care more about them, but I didn't at all. There is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I have not tried yet, but even if I really love the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's just a remake, so it's not a new game. No, I can't think of one single traditional style RPG that's been made in the last 10 to 15 years that I can really say like touched me or did something for me. Most of the time they were just monotonous kind of all the Legends games are just remakes of the same kind of concept. The Final Fantasy 12 and 14, I believe, even before 15. No, sorry, Final Fantasy 12 and 13, I believe, were still the single player RPGs. Their stories. There's a little kid crying outside. I'm sorry, folks. Give me one moment. Had the old window open. But yeah, it's just to get to the point. Like, the state of what I will say now, RPGs within the last at least 10 years has been extremely saddening for me, to the point where that's why Final Fantasy VII had to be remade. It's not just because people loved Final Fantasy VII, that's a huge part of it, but one of the main reasons Final Fantasy VII got a remake is because there's no freaking RPGs out. There's things people call RPGs, but mainly it's just been like the same 4 or 5 games remade over and over and over again. Again, the Legends games, the Dragon Quest games, the Mana games. God, it's just been like 4 or 5 kind of series that have just been remade over and over and over and over again. And Final Fantasy games at least had some phenomenal depth to them in the original sense. Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, they were all so different. Final Fantasy X, and even when they intertwined common elements, they did it in such a way that it was phenomenal. And then it just has died out incredibly so, to the point that the most exciting thing for me in the RPG sphere would be for there to be a remake of Legend of Dragoon, or Final Fantasy IX, or Final Fantasy VIII, or Final Fantasy VI, or I'm more interested in seeing remakes of RPGs than having any kind of hope that a new kind of RPG is going to excite me, because the stories just suck, and all the great storytelling is going into more adventure style games, which is nothing wrong with that. Maybe it's just that the old style of RPG is just, it's over. Maybe it's just done and I should give up hope. To be fair, there's some JRPGs I have not tried because they're, let's say, only on Nintendo, and I refuse to buy a Nintendo console just to play 1 or 2 games. Nintendo drives me freaking insane of their refusal to allow their games to be ported to PC, or just never even trying. Nintendo is one of the most stubborn companies I've ever met in my life. Not that I've met them personally, but yeah, it's a struggle, people. It's a true struggle. I think for the RPG lovers, especially people who grew up in my generation, there's just not much there, and there's something missing out. Like, if I have to just keep replaying Final Fantasy 7 and 8 and 9 to get my kicks, it's kind of depressing that there's nothing out there that follows those same kind of traditional ways of doing things, but actually comes up with an interesting story. So that would be nice if it would happen. Shout out to, maybe I'm just blind. Maybe I haven't seen certain games and people can just let me know so I can try them out. But so far I've gone over lists and lists online and never found anything. maybe I'm crazy. I'm not seeing these things. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know your opinions on the state of, we will say, RPGs over the last 10 years or so. Are there any titles out there that have really sparked your interest and really made you feel magical? Have you seen any upcoming games that might be really, really fantastic? Let me know if you've played FF7 Remake and how great it is, because I'm going to get it eventually. And stay geeky, everyone. Check out the old website, GeeksnBarbells.com. Like, subscribe, comment below, and as always, don't catch the virus. Stay good, stay healthy. I love you all.